In May 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court outlawed racial segregation in public schools.
In a unanimous decision, the 9 Supreme Court justices ruled racial segregation in publicly supported schools to be unconstitutional, declaring that it denied equal opportunity.
Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka wasn't just a single case. It was actually 5 separate lawsuits combined into one and litigated by a team of lawyers that included Thurgood Marshall. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the majority opinion and said the following: "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place." After the decision, some public schools tried to integrate, while others pushed back, even closing down entire districts. Welcome to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we look back on Brown v. Board of Education and what education looks like today, some 70 years later. We'll hear about the youth nonprofit Connecticut and how it's addressing some of the inequities students still face in Hartford. And later, we look at the legacy of Ellen Peters. She was the first woman appointed to the Connecticut Supreme Court and later became the first woman Chief Justice. She played a key role in an historic school desegregation case here in Connecticut. But first, we reflect on Brown v. Board with Kathy Trusty. She's an independent historian and children's author. I asked Kathy about the origins of this landmark case.
Okay, so the Brown v. Board of Education is actually 5 cases. The first case was actually filed in South Carolina. It was called Briggs v. Elliott. And in that particular case, parents of Black students, their request at that time was a bus to take their kids to school, as they wanted the state or the Board of Education to provide a transportation for their kids, the same as they did for white kids. And one of the things they mentioned was their tax money helps providing the bus for the white kids, but at the same time, their tax money was not providing transportation for them. So, of course, they filed a lawsuit and they lost that case. Another case was in the District of Columbia. In Washington, D.C., a new school was being built for an upcoming school year. And Black parents in Washington, D.C., they asked the Department of Education to open that new school as an integrated school. The school was built for white students. And the parents did a lot of research and they were able to determine that there was plenty of rooms for Black kids in the school. There were a lot of extra classrooms they know would not be used. They petitioned to have Black students attend the school, and of course that was turned down. In Delaware, there were 2 cases that became one case. One was Beulah v. Gebhardt, and the second was Belton v. Gebhardt. And with Belton v. Gebhardt, 12 Black students living in Claymont, Delaware, had to travel from Claymont, Delaware, which was about an hour each day, to get to the all-Black school in Wilmington, Delaware. So the parents petitioned for the kids, the students, to attend Claymont High. And the second case in Delaware was Beulah v. Gebhardt, and Shirley Beulah was 6 years of age, and every day a bus there was no bus transportation for Black kids. This was in Hockessin, Delaware. And every day a bus carrying white kids would pass her house, taking the kids to their school, and Shirley would not have any transportation. She had to either walk or her parents would have to stop what they were doing at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day to take their child to school. They asked the Department of Education to provide bus transportation for Shirley Beulah, and they denied that. So the parents went to Lewis Redden, who was the first and only Black lawyer in Delaware for about 10 years, to ask, they wanted him to help them secure transportation for Shirley Beulah, but he said he did not want to help her get transportation to a segregated school. At that time, he was already representing the students at Claymont High, Belton v. Beulah, and he said if you wanted to apply to sue to have your daughter admitted to the white school, then he would do that. So he combined the 2 cases. Of course, we know Topeka, Kansas, the Linda Brown's film, she had to walk to school when there was a fine school in her neighborhood, just much closer. the all-white school was much closer to where she lived than the all-black school that she had to attend. So parents there wanted their kids to be able to go to the school in their neighborhood. And the last case was in Virginia, and this was one of the cases. It was actually started. It was a student-led case in the beginning. A student, the school, of course, the schools were inferior, and so one of the students there, she led a student protest because they did not like their school was inferior. It was made of tar paper, and the school was originally built for fewer students than it had at the time. So they walked out of school, and then the parents got involved. So they too filed a lawsuit. So all the cases made their way to the Supreme Court, where they were all combined under Brown v. Board of Education. And that's how it all started.
I appreciate you for laying out the scope of what was happening at the time, because I think too often people just think that it was about this one issue or one case in Topeka. And what you've just shown us, Kathy, is that these were cases all across the country, that segregated schools weren't just an issue in the South. They were also issues in the Northeast, in the North, in the Midwest. It really was a countrywide problem. And then we get this culminating case of Brown v. Board that makes it all the way to the highest court in the land. Talk to our listeners about Charles Hamilton Houston and the key role that he played in moving this forward.
Well, Charles Hamilton Houston is, most people have like the one person that they love above most other in history, and he's one of my favorites. Charles Hamilton Houston, he went to Amherst College, and during World War I, he was in the military. It was a segregated military. The way the black officers were treated made him come to a decision that this has to end. And he said that once this war is over, he's going to go to law school and he's going to fight so that Black people do not have to go through what he went through. So after the service, he ended up going to Harvard Law School, and he was actually the first Black person on the Harvard Law Review. We all know that Barack Obama was the first president of the Harvard Law Review, but Charles Hamilton Houston was the first Black editor on the Harvard Law Review. After law school, he worked with his father, who was also an attorney. He worked with his father for a while. And then he became dean of Howard University, historically Black Howard University Law School. And at that time, it was only a nighttime curriculum. It was a part-time curriculum. They did not have accreditation for the American Bar Association. There was another accrediting organization too. They were not accredited there either. So he secured accreditation for Howard Law School, and he also turned it into a full-time law curriculum, and he added a lot of rigorous civil rights courses. And he ended up training this great team of lawyers who understood civil rights, how to fight civil rights. And one of his students was Thurgood Marshall, who had graduated from Lincoln University and had wanted to go to law school. He did not apply to the University of Maryland, which is where he wanted to go, because he knew he wouldn't be accepted. And this is how he ended up at Howard University Law School as a student of Charles Hamilton Houston, and became part of the Brown case. They all wanted to end segregation in public school. Houston knew that they needed to start at in a higher level law school or graduate school, because he knew he had gone around the country taking pictures of different things, and he had pretty much taken the pulse. He knew how the country would react to these cases, and he knew it would be more palatable for them if they were fighting segregation at a higher level than with little kids in first grade, second grade, or whatever. So they decided that they would find cases in either law school or graduate school that they could hopefully win and set a precedent, so that they could later go full force and end the segregation in public schools. The goal was to end segregation in elementary and in secondary schools.
One of the things that I want to point out for our listeners as well, Charles Hamilton Houston, who is really the dean, not just of Howard University Law School, but the dean of using the law in order to push these cases, creates this legacy and this lineage of Thurgood Marshall as his former student, who then goes before the court. Constance Baker Motley, Connecticut's own Constance Baker Motley, wrote the original complaint in Brown v. Board and then goes on to fight many of these cases in higher education. And so how Charles Hamilton Houston is able to encourage them to go forth is critical. The other piece, Kathy, that I think we should address is many people hear Brown v. Board. They know that in 1954, there was this case to end segregation in schools, and they think that was it. And yet you and I both know there were these subsequent cases, whether it's Brown 2 in 55 or Green in 68, because districts did not comply with the order in 1954. And not only did not comply, many districts created new barriers to make sure their schools could remain segregated. What was the impact of this monumental decision in 54? What was the impact of that in terms of actual practice?
Well, just to go back, Brown did not come with a decree or order. They simply said segregation in public school was unconstitutional. And the later case, Brown 2, which was a year later in May, I don't remember what day in May, but May of 1955, they said that schools should desegregate with all deliberate speed. And I know there was almost a little joke about what does all deliberate speed mean? And Thurgood Marshall said it meant slow. So the problem was the law was changed, and you can change a law, but the people didn't change. And in some instances, in most places, it was years later before the schools were fully integrated or desegregated. And I don't know if we ever reached desegregation, but because segregation was no longer legal, the school was supposed to have been integrated, but they were really not because of where people live. So a lot of people pushed back. In South Carolina, there was a threat that they would take state funding from a school that accepted Black students. Things are pretty smooth, I believe, in Kansas as in Washington, D.C., even though old segregationists tried to block it. But a lot of parents, white parents, did pull their kids out of public schools and send them to private school. In Virginia, they actually closed the schools for 5 years, and some Black students during that time were not able to attend school at all. So there was a lot of pushback around the country.
And I think that reality of, yes, it was a monumental case, but there was so much work still to be done. And even where we are in 2024, 70 years later, that work continues. My own experience of going to elementary school in the 1980s and being bused across town and all the resistance in the 80s. And I think people are sometimes surprised of, oh, wait, that is an ancient history. Thinking, Kathy, about where we are now, 70 years later, what would you say to people is the legacy of Brown v. Board as we think about education and history today? What's the legacy?
I say the Brown's legacy is not fulfilled because other laws came into effect. In Delaware has a Neighborhood Schools Act, which means you go to the school in your neighborhood. And because of redlining where people live, kids in suburban areas, probably around the country, they end up going to the schools in their neighborhood, and most of their neighbors look like them, so most of their classmates are going to look like them. The schools are no longer segregated, but they're not integrated either because the law changed that. But because of where people live, there's still a lot of segregation. I mean, I like this quote by Thurgood Marshall. There's a quote that he said, "Do what is right and the law will catch up." But I think what has happened is because the law says segregation is illegal, a lot of people are thinking, oh, our problems are gone. There's no more racism because this law is on the book. But if people are not following the law, if they're pushing back, the law is there, but if no one is enforcing the law, we're still back to where we were from the beginning. So I just think the legacy of Brown is not fulfilled. Charter schools didn't help hasn't helped that. And like I said, and mainly it's because it's the makeup of our neighborhoods. Schools look like our neighborhoods. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. A lot has been done, but there's a lot of work to be done. And I think maybe more could have been done, but these were great lawyers on the Brown team, and they were such great lawyers that Thurgood Marshall becomes the Supreme Court justice. Other lawyer, Constance Baker Motley, becomes the first Black female federal judge. And a lot of these lawyers went on to do great things. And then shortly after Brown, Emmett Till was killed, the civil rights, it did spark other things, the civil rights movement and all of that. So we just still, as far as I'm concerned, there's still a lot that needs to be done and should be done.
The beauty of understanding history is that it provides context for what has happened, and it provides a roadmap for what needs to happen in order to make real the full promise of Brown. And so we thank you for your work in reminding us of that. Kathy Trusty is an independent historian, Black history educator, and children's book author based in Delaware. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
Coming up, Connecticut's Andrea Williams talks about closing the opportunity gap in Hartford. You're listening to Disrupted. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're looking at education, 70 years after Brown v. Board of Education. The decision did address racial inequities in education when it was first decided in the 50s, but today, school segregation continues to be a challenge, including here in Connecticut. The think tank New America recently analyzed 25,000 pairs of neighboring school districts to better understand the racial and economic divisions across schools. The state of Connecticut had 23 of the top 300 most unequal district borders in the country. The border between Hartford and South Windsor ranked the highest at 14. School districts like Hartford's often struggle to get the resources that they need to better serve students. Earlier this year, Hartford Public Schools faced a $77 million budget deficit. Nearly 400 staff positions were in jeopardy, and state and city leaders recently announced that they would add $10.5 million to the budget. But that still may not be enough to avoid layoffs altogether. To talk more about education opportunity gaps is Andrea Williams. She's executive director of Connecticut. It's a youth development nonprofit located in Hartford. Andrea, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to talk about your organization and in particular its mission and its commitment, because the group has been doing this work for so long, and I want our listeners to get a sense of that. Talk to us about the origins of the organization and your current mission.
So we were started back in 1978, and we were started by members of the Asylum Hill Congregational Church and specifically focused on summer support during those periods. So they decided to come together and raise funds and create the organization. It was initially called the West Middle School Committee. And from there, it grew into a mentoring program because they later noticed that the students needed after-school support for academic. The students weren't on task as far as reading. So, and then we changed the name as well to Connecticut, where we're connecting kids to people, places, and opportunities and exposing them to new experiences. And so from there, we have changed our mission since I've been there. I've been here for the last 15 years now. And our mission is to connect students facing systemic inequities and other barriers with people, places, and experiences that leaven the playing field and inspire academic achievement, positive life choices, and big dreams, which is very, very important, especially for our youth in the Hartford area.
It's a big mission, right? It's also a bold mission. And as I'm listening to you talk about that mission, Andrea, and how it has changed since its founding in 1978, I'm reminded that so much of the dialogue is about this achievement gap, this assumption that kids just aren't performing well in school and they just need to study more, they need to focus more. But really what you're talking about is an opportunity gap, that if kids, and really their families too, are connected to these opportunities and these experiences, you can see these transformations not just in the classroom, but really in the whole person and how the community can affirm that. What are some of the structural challenges or inequities that the children that you work with are navigating in their day-to-day lives?
Absolutely. Some of the things that we are seeing at the moment are students aren't receiving equitable opportunities. And so, we saw firsthand where students during the pandemic were struggling with technology, lack of internet, lack of, food. Most of our students receive free or reduced lunch. So it just also proves that they don't receive, they don't have enough funding at home to support the food. And then also another thing that I'm seeing is that the amount of dollars that are spent per student in schools that are in this area is completely different from neighboring towns that may have more funding that supports, things like art, music, sports, and other after-school opportunities and more educational opportunities. So I think some of those things that are not offered in the poorer communities do set kids at a disadvantage for not having more exposure to, opportunities that can empower them and enhance them in ways that allow them to learn more things and be stronger as individuals.
One of the things that occurs to me as you're going over those challenges is that so many of the societal barriers that we learned about during the pandemic, things like access to safe, affordable childcare or safe, affordable elder care, because we have not addressed that as a state or as a city or really as a country, then what happens is that young people are often the ones who have to bear that cost of staying home to take care for a younger sibling or staying home to take care of an elder in the family. And it's hard then for them to be able to focus on those things that we tell students is their quote unquote job, because they're playing this role of interpreter and translator and advocate for the family. I'm wondering what you're hearing from the students themselves and their families as they're navigating this.
So from luckily for the young ones, they're in a great mindset and a great space. So we're always grateful for the little ones who are just very innocent and just learning and growing. But as far as the elementary to middle school students, or I would say, anywhere from 6th to 8th grade and beyond, what we're hearing are students are nervous about, pursuing education beyond high school. What does that look like for them? Are they going to be going to be prepared for college? Are they going to have the funds to even attend college? And parents are concerned about how do they even start the process and what does that look like? Is that something that my child can even achieve? Is that something our family knowing, sometimes not a lot of families that we serve currently, their parents have not been didn't attend college. And so a lot of the kids are first time college, like they're attending or preparing to attend college for the first time, being a first generation. And so a lot of those things are things that they're navigating. And I would say the biggest concern is just, am I, from the child's perspective, am I prepared for high school and or college? And, what does my future career look like? And am I going to be able to make enough funds to provide the necessary things for myself? And as far as parents are concerned, is just, will they be able to support their child to be able to progress into, further education? So I think those are two of the things that we've been hearing. I mean, among other things, but I think that's something that stood out to me. And I thought that's just been a a long time issue for many folks that are Black and Brown in our community.
I think that demographic composition is key there, that you are working with many Black and Brown families in the area who feel disconnected from other spaces and from decision making. And the point I want to emphasize, because I think it gets lost so often in these discussions, these are families, these are kids who want better, who want to be able to have a positive future where they have choices and where they can create stability for themselves and their families. And I think that's important, because the other piece about Connecticut is that your organization offers so many programs, not just mentoring and tutoring, but really this commitment and investment in the whole person and their well-being. Share with us a couple of those programs that Connecticut is creating and overseeing.
So we are just proud to be folks who are passionate about the work that we do. And we offer tutoring and mentoring. So every child in our program receive a mentor, and that's for about 90 minutes where they sit and talk. They cover homework, they talk about future goals, they talk about challenges they may experience within school or the community or home. And then we, collectively find solutions to encourage them to push on. And we also want to make sure that we're developing their vocabulary, exposing them to literature that makes sense and connect to their culture. So we do have a book club that offers them opportunity to read. We also have an enrichment program that exposes our youth to various art forms. So art, martial arts, dance, cooking is one of our main program because health and nutrition is essential. And we want to make sure that they have a good understanding of, what ingredients are important for them to have in their body, how to read labels, why is it important to have a home cooked meal, how do you shop at the grocery store, things like that, because they're surrounded by stores that do not have fresh foods and access to grocery stores are further out. And so providing them with the knowledge that they can have a small herb garden or something in the window to encourage, some healthy eating is very important. So we do offer that as well. We offer a full summer program that typically range between 4 to 6 weeks. And that's a full day program between 9 and 3:30 p.m. And that's where we couple our educational program and our exploration program. So they are able to do some classes in the morning. And then once we feed them for lunch, we break to explore the community. And then we also offer a civic engagement and counselor and training program. And that's where our older students come in and they receive career and education training, allowing them to explore topics that are important to them, that impacts them within their community, and then taking a look within Hartford and then looking outside and looking at the bigger picture of Connecticut. That's our core programs.
So, Andrea, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education decision that was meant not only to integrate public schools, but to move the country closer to racial equity by providing students, all students, with these opportunities. And partially what I've heard from you today is that we haven't yet gotten there. Share with our listeners how the legacy of that shapes the work that you do and the commitment that you have to ensure that the children of Hartford and beyond do in fact have access to opportunity.
We've moved the needle, but we haven't gotten very far. For some, they would say that yes, education has come a long way, but that's for some part of the country and some groups and culture, but not for most Black and Brown youth. And especially in the poorer neighborhoods that are separated by wealthier, districts. And so it is so important that we find a way to provide equity and inclusion in our schools that provides proper finances that support all of our children, no matter what their zip code is, right? No matter what school district they're going into. Every child deserves the right to have educators that are properly trained, receiving professional development and having access to proper lessons. Every child deserves the right to have nurses and computers and technology that supports their learning, having a safe space, having security that makes sense and makes them feel safe within the building, and having an opportunity for parents to come into the building and learn and have resources as well, making sure that the schoolhouse is a place seen as a beacon of light and where folks can work together collectively, making sure that the children are learning, separation of resources based on where kids live is really causing a negative impact on the mental health of our young people, because they can see, they're smart, they can see the difference between if they met someone from a different town versus what their experience is. And it is something that says, hey, well, that means my school or my family or my friends aren't as important as, this next person who received these exposures. So it is important for us to also value them and make sure that they see the value within themselves. And so those are some of the things that we just need to take more seriously and make sure that we're impacting our youth in a way that enhance our future and leave a legacy that allows them to become the next generation that empowers our whole country.
I think many people don't give young people enough credit for just how smart they are, how wise they are, how committed they are. And so we appreciate the work that you are doing in your organization to really affirm young people so that they can be whatever it is that they want to be. Andrea Williams is Executive Director of Connecticut. It's a nonprofit youth development organization based in Hartford. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you very much.
Coming up, we talk about the legacy of the late Justice Ellen Peters. She was the first woman appointed to Connecticut Supreme Court and the first female Chief Justice in the state. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're looking at public education 70 years after the historic Brown v. Board of Education decision. Back in April, Connecticut lost a key advocate in the fight to better integrate schools in the state. Justice Ellen Peters died at the age of 94, leaving behind an impressive legacy of public service. In 1978, Peters became the first woman appointed to the state Supreme Court. 6 years later, she became the court's first female Chief Justice. In a landmark 1996 case, Chief Justice Peters wrote the majority opinion in Sheff v. O'Neill. Much like the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board, the court found in Sheff v. O'Neill that racial and socioeconomic isolation of Hartford school children violated state law. Joining me now are two people who served along with Chief Justice Ellen Peters. Chief Justice Richard Robinson is in his 6th year serving on the Connecticut Supreme Court. We're also joined by former Justice Richard Palmer, who served for 27 years and is now chairman of the State Public Defender Services Commission. Gentlemen, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you for having us.
Chief, let's start with you because you have been in your role since 2018. You made history in becoming the first African-American Chief Justice here in the state of Connecticut. For our listeners, share with them what that role entails.
Well, basically, you're running the entire judicial branch of the state of Connecticut. There are between 3,000 and 4,000 employees. Our budget is $500 million a year. And we're responsible for everything that's connected with the judicial branch of government.
It's an expansive role. It's one that comes with a lot of attention, a lot of responsibility. And I want to circle back in a moment because I'm curious whether being the first in a groundbreaking role comes with its own set of challenges. Before we do that, let me bring you in, Justice Palmer, because someone else who made history in being appointed in that role was former Chief Justice Ellen Peters, who became the first woman appointed to the state Supreme Court in Connecticut. You worked with her quite closely in the past as well. Who was she and what did she bring to the court?
Well, as you know, she was the first female appointee to the Connecticut Supreme Court, having been the first woman to serve on the Yale faculty, tenured faculty, and then the first Chief Justice. She was a person of really unparalleled intelligence, incredibly articulate, a great colleague in that regard. She was a brilliant writer as well, and I would say led by example. She was not a political bent at all. That was not her background. She was, an academic and a scholar, and but she was a leader just by virtue of the way she conducted herself.
One of the challenges I often think for people in the legal field, particularly those on the court, is having that objectivity versus that public perception, as you mentioned, Justice Palmer, of are you viewed as being political, or are you viewed as advancing what is the best interest for the state in alignment with the law? We are now celebrating the 70th anniversary of the historic Brown v. Board of Education decision, which was meant to promote greater integration and equity in schools. But what also makes Justice Peters so distinct here is that she really helped us realize just focusing on the federal level would not be enough in order to advance those interests. It really had to be at the state level as well. Share with our listeners sort of the broad strokes of Sheff v. O'Neill, because that was such a seminal piece of her judicial history as well. What was happening in Connecticut that made that even necessary?
Well, as she explained in her majority opinion, there was extreme racial and ethnic isolation in the public schools of the state. And the plaintiffs had raised the claim that violated the state constitution. Because there was not what's called sufficient state action. The state wasn't specifically or directly responsible for that. It's just simply the way our towns were organized, and sort of as a result of the demographics, it had occurred. But then Chief Justice Peters, in applying the state constitution, concluded that racial and ethnic isolation, really segregation, combined with the right to a public elementary and secondary education, reading those two provisions conjointly, as she put it, required the state to remedy that problem in the Hartford school system, which was the subject of the litigation. And that's what happened, leaving, I think, really rather brilliantly, the remedy to the executive branch and the legislature. And that's something that has taken, literally decades to work through. But it kept the court, although the court retained jurisdiction over the case, the court was not, intimately involved in deciding exactly what the remedy was going to be, which would be very controversial.
What stood out to you, Judge Palmer, about the arguments that were made in that Sheff v. O'Neill case that created opportunities for Connecticut to really stand out? So it wasn't just about Justice Elaine Peters breaking new ground. It was about Connecticut saying, we are really setting a standard for the rest of the country to decide what they're going to do.
The Sheff case is a very complicated case. The litigation underlying Sheff was very complicated and long-standing. The case, winded its way through the system, and when it got to the Supreme Court, Ellen was able to sort of distill the arguments into what in some respects is an essay. In some ways, not dissimilar to Brown versus Board of Education, explaining that the right of education in Connecticut and the right to be protected from state-sponsored segregation in any way, those two constitutional provisions required that the state remedy that situation. And it took a lot of courage, really, for her and other members of that court to do what they did. It was quite controversial, and I can't think of anyone I've ever served with, on the court, who would be less influenced by those concerns. She was simply devoted to doing what she thought was the right thing under the law, and she did, and she was very firm about it. And I in anticipation of our discussion today, I had occasion to reread the majority opinion in Sheff, and it's beautifully and brilliantly written.
Beautifully and brilliantly written. And I think you capture the essence of so much of what we're learning about Justice Peters in terms of her legacy and her approach. Justice Robinson, as I mentioned in the beginning of our convo, you made history when you were named as Chief Justice of the court. And to make history can be a dual-edged challenge of people assuming of how you will be in that position. Sometimes people have unrealistic and unfair expectations. And at the end of the day, your job is always to uphold the law. How does the legacy that you have built and that you are continuing of saying to people, yes, I may be first, but my commitment to the law does not waver based on identity. How does that come together for you now as you think about the challenges for the state of Connecticut and the role that the court can play in that?
Thank you for that question. And it's a hard question to answer because one of the things that I think is going on in our society today is you have this sort of a paradox of recognizing that there are problems in our country, recognizing there are racial problems in our country, and at the same time, wanting to strive for a society that is colorblind, where those kinds of things do not matter. But the problem is it's a spectrum when people look at it. And you have to my philosophy was to try to keep everybody in the room, especially those who disagreed with me. Because if I couldn't have that conversation, whether it was in person or through an opinion, if I couldn't have that conversation, I've lost that person. And I can never advance the where we need to go in our society. So I always try to be very careful with dealing with these issues. And I think Chief Justice Peters did the same thing, where one of the things Justice Palmer sort of touched on this, she wrote beautifully. And even when she was in dissent, she wrote her dissents in a way that panels of tomorrow, panels of the future would pick up on and say, you know what, Chief Justice Peters was right when she wrote that all those years ago. That influenced my style. I tried to write somewhat like her to let people know I may not win this issue today. And I tell my clerks this all the time. Let's write so we can win tomorrow if we can't win today. Being the first, I realized that I couldn't get all the things accomplished that I wanted to, and neither could she. But I built on reports that she did. When she was the Chief Justice, we advanced the ball further. And I'm hoping that in the future, someone will pick it up and go even further than I was able to do it. But I couldn't do that if I was going to be a controversial figure. So I had to sort of keep all these balls in the air at the same time. It's been a privilege to do this, and I know it's a privilege for her. And I got to work with her, which was also just amazing. I do want to tell one little story about her that I think that people may be interested in. We were on the appellate court together. She was on there as what's called the judge trial referee. And there were the appellate court sits in panels of three. And this case involved Uniform Commercial Code. Justice Peters had this expertise in the Uniform Commercial Code. So we were sitting there, and one of the attorneys was arguing his position on the UCC. And he sort of mansplained it. He was explaining to Chief Justice Peters about this provision of the Uniform Commercial Code. And Justice Palmer is smiling, and I heard him laugh because he knows what's coming. So we're sitting there, and this guy is explaining it to her, and she looks at him, and in a way that only Justice Peters can do it. She put her hand to her forehead and said, well, when I wrote the editorial comment for that section of the UCC, and it was like the two other judges are sitting there, we were looking at, we knew that was going to happen. But she did it in such a professional, intelligent way of letting this person know that, no, I know this and I know this well, but without putting him down. It was just, it was a masterclass on how to assert your position without treating your opponent badly. It was incredible to watch.
Chief Justice Robinson, as we come to the close of our conversation today, this is an episode where we're talking about the legacies of Brown v. Board. We're talking about the legacies of Sheff v. O'Neill, and really looking forward to what's on the landscape and the horizon for education here in Connecticut. What would you say to listeners, to what they should be paying attention to? The courts, the law seems so removed from many people. And yet the legacy of Chief Justice Peters was, no, this is the place that really connects to not just the moment, but the future. What would you say to listeners?
I would say this, that I think people need to become more involved with government. You can't just have individuals out there advancing things. You can't just have Chief Justice Peters or Chief Justice Robinson. You need everyone to be out there. And people who don't agree with me, yes, I need you in the system too. We need to have these discussions in the marketplace. I think that Chief Justice Peters was the kind of person who could not only start the conversation, she could continue the conversation. She was incredibly influential on what happened with the law in Connecticut, and will be influential on the law as it's going to come out in years to come. Education is still an issue in Connecticut. Sheff versus O'Neill's still going on in different ways. There's another case called CJEF, which also involves that same kind of a thing. But in Connecticut, there's a constitutional right to an education. Now we have to figure out what exactly that means. And those will be the cases of the future. So my biggest thing is don't give up, keep working, keep moving ahead. And Connecticut's a great place to be because of people like Justice Ellen Peters.
Justice Palmer, what should we take forward as we think about the challenges and really the possibilities here in Connecticut? What should we take forward from the legacy of Chief Justice Peters?
I'd be hard pressed to say it any better than or as well as the Chief Justice, but before Ellen Peters was appointed to the court in 1978, state constitutional jurisprudence around the country was relatively unknown. It was not a major aspect of litigation in any of the state courts really around the country. Ellen Peters was truly a pioneer in that regard too, and understood that the state constitution in Connecticut and elsewhere provide rights that are not just coextensive with the U.S. Constitution, but in many instances greater, subject to the interpretation of the state constitution by the highest, by the Supreme Court. And I think that that's, in a way, maybe her most important legacy, because there have been some very significant state constitutional cases over the last 3 or 4 decades. And I think that Ellen Peters is truly directly responsible for that movement, so to speak.
Richard A. Robinson is Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court. Justice Richard Palmer served for 27 years and now chairs the State Public Defender Services Commission. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Wayne Edwards, Meg Dalton, and Katie Tularski. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.